Okay, so welcome back for another week. Now, I think some of, or at least some of you, will be joining us on the site visit a little bit later on to just to get on site and to view a building partially constructed. That building in question is just here on the corner of Norman Street and Alice Road. And we're just in this bit in here in the Tonsley campus. So it's a fairly simple procedure to get there from here, head up here on South Road, turn left onto Alice Road, and then the first left, and we're right on the corner of this section in here. So should take only 5 minutes by car, but whatever time to walk down with cars as well. So we'll finish up today's session a little bit early, finish at about 22 or so, give ourselves enough time to get there. Everybody who's coming on site, did you bring, I guess you would have brought a phone for taking pictures. You've probably brought your printout for your assignment, your site visit assignment, and you've organised what information you need to get on site. Okay, this is in regards to the site visit. Are you coming on the site visit?
Is that today?
It is today?
No.
Yeah?
No.
Okay, yeah.
No, because I've already taken all my photos.
Okay, you've done, you've got on site, done everything, yeah. Yep. That's cool. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, mostly it's just for people who haven't been able to get on site for now to,
I see. Okay.
To meet that. So we'll just be finishing the class slightly early.
Sure.
Yeah. So so that's where we'll be going. And you're coming to site, I remember. So this property is on the corner here of Norman Street and Alice Road. It's just in here, there. And so we are in this bit here at the TAFE. So we just head out here onto South Road, turn left onto Alice Road, and then the first left off Alice Road again as well. And did anybody need a lift there? Anybody? You need a lift?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, you can jump in my car. That's all right. Yeah. But the rest of you have cars. You need a lift, Anthony? You do? Okay, you come with me. Come with me as well. Yeah. Only you're driving there yourself?
Yeah.
Hey? Cool. Okay. Yeah, gonna start to get a bit squishy in my car. Yeah. A bit more, so that's fantastic, much appreciated. So last week we made a start on masonry. So the important thing in regards to masonry, so that our most commonly used masonry unit in construction is the brick, the humble brick, and the very important takeaway message about the bricks are the standard size of the brick and how that relates to our dimensioning of buildings. So our spacing of openings and size of openings, etc. We also have metric blocks such as Besser blocks and metric bricks as well. They have obviously they have different dimensions and end up resulting in sizes of increments of 300 millimeters, 400 millimeters, and 200 millimeters. So this is where we got to last week in regards to the pointing of brickwork. So there are many different approaches to pointing the brickwork, but our most common is the, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth one down is the rate. So that's typically what we'll see on a standard residential build. With our solid masonry construction, typically we also need to tie those solid masonry walls into an internal structure, and that we do via single leaf brick walls on the interior of the building. Whereas with our brick veneer, our standard brick veneer, we tie back to a structural frame. With our brick veneer, we have a cavity width of between 25mm up to a maximum of 60mm, but typically, by and large, this cavity width is going to be 40mm. The stud work is then fixed to the masonry, or the masonry is fixed to the stud work by wire ties at 600 centres. So our studs are spaced at 600 centres, and then our ties go to each stud, and then 600 centres in a vertical fashion. It's important in brick veneer or in any masonry construction, cavity brick as well, is that we allow moisture to come out of that cavity. So it's, how to say it, the way we design, we certainly try to stop moisture going into that cavity, but accept that moisture will always make its way into that cavity fairly much no matter what we do. And so we always have to leave accommodation for allowing moisture to come out of the cavity in the brickwork, and that means we have to have a weep hole at every fourth brick along that brick veneer wall. The way we end up getting our moisture out of that cavity is by having a flashing in at the base of the wall that will direct water out of that weep hole. So we've got our stud work here, our bottom plate, bottom of that, our slab, our brickwork starting from there, and our flashing nailed back to our studs carries out under our brickwork, and we have our weep holes in there at our lower course to allow water to exit the cavity. So that's nailed back to that, and then we also have a damp-proof course as well under here. But also, it's also noted there, air vent at 1 metre intervals. That is for subfloor ventilation. It's not a very common practice now to do a brick veneer building with suspended timber floors. But in the case in which we are doing suspended timber floors or working with a building that has suspended timber floors, that those air vents have to be at 1 metre intervals. And for doing any addition work where you're designing additions, it is very important to observe that ventilation. The reason for that is there is a lot of salt damp that happens in buildings that have had additions put on them, because those additions end up closing up the air vents along the wall, and those air vents are designed to vent that subfloor cavity. And when that subfloor is not adequately ventilated, you build up moisture in there, and that moisture tracks its way up through the walls and presents itself as salt damp. So some of you may have seen that in buildings with additions on them. It's a very, very common area which is missed. So this is an axonometric drawing of typical timber frame construction with a brick veneer wall, and this is still by and large the majority or the most common practice for building that we see in residential subdivisions. We have our stud work, plasterboard attached to that stud work on the inside. What have we got? Well, here it's called a sole plate. We typically refer to that in South Australia as the bottom plate. We have our bottom plate and then our top plate on the top of the frame. Here we have some structural ply for uluse as bracing, various different forms of bracing. We can use structural ply or 30 by 0.8 gal strap for bracing, depending on how much bracing we're required to achieve. This bracing provides about 6 kilonewtons of restraint per linear metre, whereas our strap bracing, double strap bracing provides about 3 kilonewtons of restraint per linear metre. So it all depends on the amount of space we have for bracing and what bracing we require. Then on the outside of our stud work we have the builder's wrap or sisolation, which can be a reflective foil insulation as well, or even sometimes if we want to upgrade that, do air cell insulation on the outside of the stud work. And then we have our wall ties, so our brick ties that are nailed back to the studs, and they're built in to every every 600 millimetres up the studs to tie that wall back to the stud work. Integrity of those ties is incredibly important. Saw a building in Norwood that a better block wall that the whole thing toppled over onto another building because those wire ties had been welded back to universal beams, and then at that weld, of course, it rusted because it wasn't protected, didn't have corrosion protection, so it lasted a few years. Those points rusted, and there was nothing retaining that Besser block wall, and so it just toppled over. And they're a very, very simple thing, our wall ties, but they perform a very important function to ensure that our masonry veneer does not topple over. So this is a typical, fairly modern wire tie. So no longer made out of wire, but they're made out of thin metal sheet which is folded. So either nailed or screwed back to the studs. And here we have a picture of our subfloor ventilation or our vent bricks that need to happen every metre. Typically referred to as double brick, and I say incorrectly referred to as double brick, is cavity masonry. So that's another type of wall that we typically don't build with today, but you may encounter that for doing additions and alterations to buildings. So that's where we have two leaves of brickwork separated by a cavity. That cavity width will vary from 35 millimetres to a maximum of 65 millimetres, but typically, like our brick veneer, it's going to be that 40 millimetre cavity width. Once again, can be reinforced or unreinforced. Once again, our brick ties have to be at 600 centres, and we have to have weep holes for drainage. So very similar details there. The main difference is that we have an internal leaf of brickwork instead of a structural frame.
Did you say it's incorrectly referred to as double brick?
Yes, incorrectly
Why is
referred
that?
to as double brick. Because, I'll draw that up. Double brick is where you have two interlocking leaves of brickwork, whereas cavity brick is where you have a cavity between the two leaves of brickwork. Is that there?
Yeah, no.
Yeah. And so, we did, initially when in the older construction, we did do a lot of double brick in South Australia. That's where you got those, so the early colonial brick buildings with double brick, and there's a lot of double brick work throughout Europe. But then within South Australia, we moved fairly quickly onto cavity brick work, and it's important to make that distinction. So slightly different wall ties used for cavity brick. So these are wall ties that have accommodations at both ends for bonding into the mortar. Because we don't have a timber frame in our cavity brickwork, we also need to have some lateral restraint, and that lateral restraint is provided by having intersecting internal walls. So our single leaf brickwork, and those intersecting internal walls have to be tied in with brick ties to those external walls once again. Tying down to our frame, well, because we don't have a frame to tie down to, tie downs are a little bit more difficult. The way that we produce the tie downs is, so within our cavity brick, we typically put in a, what does it say? Yeah, we've got, it says from 900 top of wall. So between our bricks, we've got our mortar gaps, corresponding mortar gaps on the other side there, and then within that 10mm mortar gap, 900 down, we insert a 10mm rod. That rod goes between both leaves of brickwork, and our rafters go over the top. We'll have what's called a pole plate on the top, but then our gal strap, our 30mm by 0.8 gal strap, will loop around that 10mm rod, which is embedded into the wall, and produce the tie down for our rafter, tying our rafter down into that brickwork. And if we look at that in elevations, this is our wall here, with our rafter above that, and our 10mm rod there, our strap going around that. So if there is a significant uplift on that rafter, that rafter has to take a whole cone of brickwork with it, as opposed to if we dynabolted down into our top course of brickwork there from our pole plate, we would only be taking top bricks out of that course. So by tying down to a rod that's inserted through the brickwork, we increase our tie down to it. So yeah, here's once again an extract from AS3700. So what we have, it's up there. It's referred to as a 25 by 1mm galvanised strap. The standard today is 30 by 0.8 at no more than 1.2 metre centres, so at 1200 centres, which corresponds to our 1200 centres for rafters for our sheet roof. The wall ties, as mentioned earlier in that example with the block wall in Norwood that came down, must be protected from corrosion as per AS 3700. It connects two leaves of masonry or masonry and timber or metal studs, so it ties our masonry back to a supporting structure. Galvanised steel or wire acts to stabilise the masonry leaves and stiffens the wall cavity structure. Has to be embedded 50mm into the mortar joint, and it also has to have effective coverage, so a minimum of 15mm coverage to any surface. This helps protect it from corrosion as well, from water on the outside of the masonry. Should be installed to prevent moisture breaching the cavity. The way that we do that is to ensure that they're installed. So this is our 10mm rod. Let's turn that into a brick tie. Ensure that they're installed flat, or if not flat, a slight slope toward the outside. But they have a drip groove in the centre, so they're shaped like this, little groove. So that when water travels down the internal face of our internal brickwork, if it makes it over there, then it hits this wire tie, travels along, hits the drip groove, and drips down the centre of the cavity. But we want to ensure that it's either level or with a slight slope toward the outside to encourage any water making its way down the cavity back towards the outside. So typically the wall ties are at 600 centres, so 600 in a horizontal fashion, 600 in a vertical fashion, except for when we get to windows, where we reduce the spacings to 300 millimetres. There are also, because, and this is part of the reason why cavity brickwork is not very popular with modern construction, is that within the National Construction Code we now have a requirement for insulation in walls. So for climate zone 5, I think we have to have an R value of 1.5 for the walls. To achieve that R value of 1.5, we need to have some form of insulation in the wall. It's still possible with cavity brickwork or cavity blockwork, but we have to have a cavity board insulation in there. To enable that, there are brick ties designed with these little cartwheels on them to hold that insulation in place. It's also one of the other major considerations working against cavity brick is that it is significantly heavy, and to resist that weight we need to have very significant footings, because our soil in South Australia, particularly on the flat area here, is very reactive. So we need to have footings which are capable of moving with the soil and picking the building up to hold that building as one, to resist this differential movement. So yeah, that differential movement caused by expansion characteristics of clay, or clay masonry and shrinkage of concrete. So it's caused by expansion characteristics of clay soils. But we also have movement in buildings that we have to accommodate for by the expansion characteristics of clay masonry and the shrinkage characteristics of concrete masonry as well. When our concrete blocks are brand new, from that point of being just cast to when they're fully cured, they will shrink a small amount. And so if we build a building with all concrete masonry with cement mortar, and we use very fresh blocks, that wall will shrink slightly. Now the best thing to do is to ensure that we have older concrete blocks, so concrete blocks that have cured correctly over time, so we don't get that shrinkage. So that shrinkage has happened, but we still need to allow for some wall shrinkage to happen, and that happens through control joints. So our control joints within the National Construction Code, we have articulation joints, expansion and contraction joints, and then the overriding name that encompasses both of those is the brick control joint. So typically on plans you'll see something like BCJ written every now and again on the plans. That refers to a brick control joint. That's to enable the expansion and contraction of the masonry, and also to compensate for any movement in the slab caused by movement in the soil. So we can, with concrete, we don't get much in the way of bending without cracking, but it still does bend very slightly. And those slight amounts of bend in a slab will translate into a wall. We want to ensure that rather than go cracking through our block work, when our slabs do move, that it just opens up these control joints and then closes those control joints. To ensure that the opening and closing of those control joints doesn't cause a problem, they're created by having a 10mm gap, and then inserting a foam backing rod into that control joint, and then a mastic seal on the front of that backing rod that enables some compression and some expansion without actually opening up and exposing the internal cavity to the outside. those control joints need to happen anywhere where we have a change in story. So we go from a 2-story to a single-story lean-to addition on the rear, or a lean-to addition wherever. We need to have a control joint in there. We also need to have a control joint wherever we have an opening that's larger than 900 millimeters. So if our window is larger than 900 millimeters tall or 900 millimeters wide, then we have to have a control joint running down the edge of that window and all the way down to the bottom course. Or if we have a door, we have to have a control joint all the way from one side of that door right down to the bottom course. We also have to have a control joint or articulation joint wherever we have a change in materials as well, because different materials will react differently to soil movement, and so we need to have a control joint between the two. So vertical control joints have to be placed in a position which doesn't compromise the strength of the structure. So typically with our brick veneer, our structure is created by the use of our timber frame, and so our control joints don't compromise the structure. With cavity masonry, it gets a little bit more complicated, and we have to think about the interaction of our control joints and how that's going to interact with the inside of the building and any intersecting walls. The opening movement joint must not exceed 10 millimeters. So we start with a 10 millimeter control joint that can open up to 20 millimeters, and closing movement not to exceed 15 millimeters. So typically our control joints are 10 millimeters wide, and they're not going to be able to close more than 15 millimeters. And the formation of those joints not to be less than 5 millimeters. But typically, because we deal with 10 millimeter mortar gaps throughout the building, throughout the brickwork, we stick to 10 millimeter gaps for control joints. So mastic is not to impede the movement of the joint and not to be toothed into a masonry wall. So that's where we're not to have that joint bridged or breached by any masonry. Closing that into a wall, so the control joints have to go from top to bottom.
Can I just ask a question, Mark?
Yeah, sure.
So in real life, is it the brickies that work out where things are, or does the building design role just say where on the plans where all these joints and things are, or how does it?
You can do both. You can say control joints as per AS 3700 and National Construction Code, 2018, and then the bricklayer, it's their responsibility to get that right, or what is typically done, because it's not that difficult for a building designer to do so, is to specify where the brick control joints go on the plans. So it is either way. What you should not do is neglect to do either. So you either have to put in lines which mark BCJ around your building, or you have to say control joints as per. Yeah. Yep.
The control joint, let's assume that you have spaces of 1.2 meter for the windows, and you have like 6 of them in front of a building. Do you need to indicate all the positions?
Yes, you do. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it not going to look awkward that you are having, because of the aesthetics, is it not going to look awkward that you have all these in front?
No, it doesn't. And what typically, if you look at a recently constructed house, how to say it, the brick control joints don't dominate the aesthetic of the building, because they have a dark mastic fill, and that will typically, if you've got a good builder or bricklayer, they match the colour of the mastic to the colour of the mortar. They don't really stand out. So, and also when you run your control joints on the sides of any openings like this, your control joint goes right to the base there. But on the side of your doorway, for example, they're going to be imperceptible. We won't see a control joint there. You'll only see them at these windows. But typically, if the colour is matched fairly well, they don't stand out and they don't look to be an unusual feature. These requirements for the location of control joints have been around for quite a while, and so it's even buildings back into the 1980s. You'll see these control joints placed fairly regularly if you look for them. Yeah, and I encourage you, for anybody who lives in a brick veneer house, to have a look at that when you get home as well. Have a look at the location of your control joints, and you'll probably notice many of them on the sides of windows, etc. Either side of that control joint, to ensure that the masonry stays tied together, you also have to have masonry ties that bridge that control joint, but they can't impede the movement of that control joint. Therefore, they're especially designed brick ties that slide in and out of each other to allow opening and closing of that control joint, but still retaining the brick wall in a lateral fashion. So we can see one of those on the top right-hand corner there. So masonry anchors must be built in every fourth course for cavity walls at junctions of windows and doors. 10mm gap must be included for movement, so that's standard. And single skin masonry wall joints must be sealed with a flexible sealant or mastic. We've covered that already. So here's a very simple floor plan, very small floor plan. There, it's been notated as an ARJ. Our typical our typical terminology for South Australia is BCJ. So we have brick control joint, so then ARJ, that stands for articulation joint. It depends on the soil classification as to what our maximum spacing of brick control joints is. For the more reactive soils, it's around 5 metres. For the less reactive soils, it's around the 6 metres. Typically, when we have a garage, the length of our garage is going to exceed 6 metres. So somewhere along that wall, we have to include a brick control joint that's not necessarily associated with a window. For around the rest of the building, we typically have significant windows or doors within that space of 5 or 6 metres. So we tick that box by having brick control joints on the sides of those openings in a very regular fashion around the remainder of the building. The only area where we have to be careful of that rule for our 5 metres or 6 metres, depending on the soil classification, is in our garage. So, used to counter movement of footings, allows walls to move in relation to footings. Used in unreinforced masonry in reactive soils, so that's us here in South Australia. Any straight continuous walls with openings, or with no openings at 6 metre centres, that, as I said before, that 6 metre centres, that's for your medium class soil or your moderate reactive. For when we get into higher reactive soils, then we're down to around that 5 metre spacing for that. We have to have a brick control joint or articulation joint at locations where there's a change in wall height of 20%, where walls change thickness. So that'll typically happen where we get a change in material, so walls are structured with different materials, or any deep rebates for service pipes. So where we have a compromised structure in the slab. So, and that is very uncommon where we'll get a scenario like that, particularly in a new build. So new builds are designed with the services, with consideration for the services when that initial design is being done, and the services typically run through the slab in a vertical fashion and then down underneath the slab. Sometimes when we've got deeper beams and we're running sewer pipes in a horizontal fashion, they will go through the slab. But typically we're not creating any deep rebates in our slab for services in the standard residential build. But if we were, so this is our slab here, and then we create a rebate in there because we had some sort of pipe or something happening through there in our brickwork over the top, draw that a bit longer brick, then we need to ensure there's a control joint happening at that location like that, because this being our slab, that is going to be a weak point, or it's going to be a point of flexure. Now, if we were to design something like this, the engineer would specify additional, steel reinforcing in here, a lot of steel in there, to ensure that this, didn't crack, didn't move excessively. But there's always a chance, or if there's going to be some movement, it's likely to happen at that location. So that's what the last one is about. Where we have walls changing thickness, so let's say we go from Besser blocks like this, to a single leaf masonry wall. Well, we're going to have a control joint there at that location, also because it's a changing in materials. So there's some more details around a brick control joint. And for anybody who's chosen brickwork for their site visit report, you'll have to, or refer to these notes for your details of your brick control joint. Within our concrete masonry, as I mentioned earlier, concrete masonry shrinks a little bit over time. To help ensure that shrinkage happens in a very uniform fashion throughout the wall, and then that shrinkage is concentrated, or the opening is concentrated at our control joints, we can use ladder mesh in between our blockwork to help control the horizontal movement or horizontal shrinkage and expansion of our concrete masonry. So, steel takes tensile forces and reduces movement. Consists of 2 steel wires in 3mm diameter, welded in a ladder pattern, placed at 600 centres above and below wall openings. Moisture is one of the biggest problems in buildings. Many of the reinstatement work that we had to do at Mount Proprietor was to do with moisture, or caused by moisture in one form or another, and also because we're on very reactive soils here. When we get moisture, we typically get expansion of soils as well. So the damp-proof course has been designed to stop moisture wicking its way up through the walls. So many of you may have seen with very old buildings, before the invention of damp-proof course, you get salt damp in buildings where our footings are exposed to moisture, and then that moisture wicks its way up through the stonework or the brickwork, takes dissolved salts with it, so that moisture brings dissolved salts in there, and then when it gets to the outside of that stonework or the brickwork, the water evaporates, leaving the salt behind, and the salt forms little crystals and wedges off little pieces of sand, also out of the stone or out of the brick in that process. So that's how salt damp works, and this is how it's caused. It's by that trapping of moisture. Yes. So I mentioned earlier, salt damp also occurs where vent holes have been blocked up in an old construction as well, and so that's caused by the fact that there's no longer ventilation of that subfloor cavity, and moisture builds up as a result and tracks its way through the walls. With this damp-proof course, that's to stop moisture coming up through the footings from the ground. So it's a continuous layer of impervious material placed in a masonry wall between floor and wall to prevent upward or downward migration of moisture. That very same material is also used as a flashing in our walls as well. So that black embossed polyethylene film or polythene film, has anybody seen that before? Has everybody seen that? Yeah, everybody's seen that material before? So where we get damp in buildings, that can be because there's a breakdown of that damp-proof course. It may be because of defective plumbing, and some defective plumbing isn't realised for quite a while as well. Some people only notice their defective plumbing when they get their water bill, and their water bill is exceedingly more than the last one, and their usage is up, but they realise we haven't used all that much water, and it can do a lot of damage to a building by that time. It can be caused by porous building materials. Condensation is actually a fairly big one. That happens where we have poorly insulated buildings. So where typically if we have, and sometimes it can be a combination of these as well. So we can have some porous building materials, which leads to more atmospheric moisture inside the house. And typically during winter time, when we warm the air inside our house, that warm air can take more moisture. It can have a higher, it takes more moisture to reach that 100% humidity in warm air. But as soon as that warm air hits a cold surface, so a cold, like an uninsulated surface, let's say glass, you get condensation on the inside face of your glass as that air cools and reaches 100% humidity and starts dropping the moisture out of the air. That can happen significantly on poorly insulated roofs, particularly if you've got raked ceilings and tile roofs. So if you've got raked ceiling, tile roof, and fairly low rafters in that, say 150 or 140 deep rafters, you can get a lot of condensation on your roof and enough to cause mold in there. So the antidote to that is just to insulate the roof adequately. You can also get moisture issues when the cavity between the two leaves of brickwork or between the brickwork and the studs are breached. That can happen by when the building was built, the excess mortar was not cleaned out, and you get bits of mortar building up on the inside of your cavity. You can also get blocked weep holes down the bottom from excess bits of mortar that weren't cleaned up correctly. And also, very commonly, it can happen as a result of ineffective flashings and damp-proof course. And also, water being given the nature of water flowing from high to low, typically, it's not always obvious where our actual source of moisture is. For example, and it's a fairly common one. So this is our mock-up, very simple house. Now it's an older one. Well, let's say we've got a brick chimney going through there. So we've built a brick chimney through the roof there like that. On the high side of our brick chimney, we are going to have a flashing that's built into that brickwork, and I'll draw it a little bit larger so we can see that it's built into that brickwork and carries down, and then carries up, and then goes underneath our sheeting, and our sheeting goes there like that. So what we're essentially doing is providing a gutter in there without flashing on the high side of our chimney. There are a lot of issues with that sort of thing all the time. If that flashing hasn't been done correctly, or building elements have moved over time and cracks have opened up, what we can have happen is moisture comes down here, hits that flashing, but it doesn't always necessarily go straight through the roof like that. It can track its way down, and if we've got reflective foil insulation or sisolation in the roof, it can make its way under there, head down like that, but then it hits like the top plate or something like that and decides to make its way down inside the wall, and it appears at the floor in a location like that. So there is a lot of that which happens in buildings as well, where we've got ineffective flashings, and that flashing can be somewhere in the roof, but the moisture makes a path, or it makes its path of least resistance in a downward fashion, and can appear somewhere else in the building. Moisture can penetrate through the external wall to the cavity and down the inside face of a wall. Very typical location for that sort of thing to be happening is at windows, and we're required to carry our flashings, I think it's 150 millimeters past the edge of the window, so there's a requirement to carry your flashings past the edge of the windows to ensure that all the moisture goes down. But yeah, where we have windows installed with brickwork, brickwork being something which is not, it's not perfectly rectilinear all the time. We don't always get really good seals between our windows and our brickwork, and that's a common area for moisture to penetrate in. And if we have ineffective flashings or flashings which have fallen the wrong way inside the cavity, then the moisture can make its way across. As mentioned before, that excess mortar from the brickwork has to be cleaned out. Need to keep the cavity clear during wall construction. You can use a board to do that. You can leave every fifth brick out of the wall so you can reach in there and clear out. Or just the old cement bags in the top of the cavity. Flashings made from all sorts of materials, so there's the polythene flashing, which is also used as our damp-proof course. But there are a multitude of mouldable products now, and that does keep changing fairly often as well. There's even a new one out. We just discovered it, which was it's basically like a really flexible double-sided tape that you can use for sticking any sort of flexible aluminium flashing to for sticking down into grooves and things like that. So there are plenty of new products for flashings. Typically, our older flashings were always done in lead. That's not used, or it's very rarely used today. But there's plenty of older flashings that were done in lead. So obvious issues with that. But other materials for making flashings: copper, bitumen coated metal, which is probably the most common one, zinc coated steel, polythene. Flashings at the base of the wall can be used to replace the damp-proof course, so that can be a flashing and a damp-proof course in one if we carry it under the bottom brick and then up and nail that to our studs. So over openings, it must extend 100 millimeters past the side of the opening and extend it across the cavity. And then must turn up 150 millimeters and be fixed to the timber frame. Flashings are also incredibly important in parapet walls. So everybody here know what a parapet wall is? I think I've described those before. Yeah. Getting sufficient nods. So with our parapet walls, both the scenarios here show our roof sheeting running perpendicular to that parapet wall. That may be the case, or the roof sheeting may be sloping away from the parapet wall or sloping toward the parapet wall. If we're sloping toward the parapet wall, then that detail gets far busier and far more complicated. But if our sheeting is running perpendicular or sloping away, then we use a detail like this, or not too dissimilar to this. So this is a detail whereby we have cavity brick wall, and then we have a flashing that goes between that cavity and then bends down into a flashing onto the roof. So the idea with flashings are that they're not watertight, but any moisture is directed to flow downhill to where we want it to be. This one has a sloping flashing over the cavity with a vent or weep hole on the outside of the wall. That's well, it's not my preferred detail. My preferred detail is this one here that has a weep hole back to the roof. This is simply because where you get pollution and mould and so on that builds up and dirt, etc., you'll get staining on the outside of your parapet wall when you have weep holes at the front. Whereas if you slope your flashing back towards your roof, all that will go onto the roof where it's not seen. So we have our first flashing that gets installed is our flashing that goes up here like this, and then our next flashing that goes bent over the top of that. We may also have a scenario whereby this is our parapet wall, a very simple parapet wall of that, and our roof sheeting. Got our flashing going down onto our roof sheeting, and then we've got a flashing coming up, and then we'll have a capping for flashing like that. That's also a fairly common scenario. So that the moisture that hits that parapet wall goes onto that, flashing onto there, and then goes down. So this is the first one to go on, second one to go on, and then that's the last one to go on. And those flashings, as we discussed in roofing, you can get pretty much any design of flashing you want bent up. So it just costs. So typically you pay for the amount of bends that you have in a piece of flashing. And you get those bent up by your roofing manufacturer, or your sheet roofing manufacturers. They supply those pre-bent flashings. Openings in masonry. So concrete or steel lintels can be used to support masonry over openings. Does anybody, and I'll be surprised if anybody does, so 10 points to anybody who does know what a Bank SA villa is. Has anybody ever seen a Bank SA villa? Yeah. You probably have. Actually, I'll do a quick Google search for them. Oh, sorry, Bank SA bungalow. No, we haven't turned any up with the Google search. Oh, no, that's cool. Okay, yeah, a lot of them throughout Pempton area, etc. The reason I mentioned those, they had concrete lintels above the windows. In fact, we'll turn our house, this house we've drawn over here to a Bank SA bungalow. So we've got our door, finishes at head height 2100, then our windows also have their head height at 2100 like that, two windows, and these Bank SA bungalows, they're only styled housing I've ever seen, have it where they've got a concrete lintel that runs all the way around the building. So there's a band of concrete around the building above all the doors. Well, runs all the way around the building, just simplified. So that's all concrete there. Just simplify the construction of the building. So you may see them now that I've mentioned it, typically red brick with a concrete band all the way around the outside at the height of the doors and windows. Makes it fairly simple for modification to those load-bearing walls because we have our lintel that runs continuously all the way around. But that's pretty much the only scenario. Well, you get a few other scenarios where you've got concrete lintels, but they're not very common.
Why are they called bungalows?
They're called Bank SA bungalows because it was a housing start program whereby people of low or moderate income could get these houses built cheap by Bank SA.
What decade was it?
1950s and 60s. Yeah, so late 50s I think, sort of like, or 55 onwards I think, at that time. So hence, a lot in the Plimpton area when that was being built. Yeah. But you may see concrete lintels about the place in other scenarios as well. More typically, you have steel lintels in your masonry. So typically steel angled lintels are used over openings, both in single leaf walls and double cavity walls. It says single leaf wall, a flat bar lintel. It's a rule of thumb that's probably best not applied. Yep.
I have a question. This Bank SA bungalow,
Yep.
when you're designing with brick, are you still gonna have it sort of, because I know lintel is more like a concrete or something like that. Are you still gonna have it on top of the brick?
Yes. So that lintel that goes on top of the brickwork and it's supported by the brickwork, but it supports all the brickwork above that opening. So that, yeah.
Is there any bars inside the concrete?
There are, yes, yeah. So if I was to draw a cross section through that concrete lintel or that wall, our concrete lintel is like this. So we've got probably 12mm bars inside that concrete lintel, and then our brickwork down beneath that, and then our brickwork up above it as well. Wire ties between two. And for those doing drafting, that's our standard hatch that we use for our brickwork as well. So ASNI 32, that horizontal hatch denotes brickwork as well. So so we have a detail like that with steel bars inside those concrete lintels. I have seen some concrete lintels in seaside locations failing. That happens where we don't have adequate coverage of that concrete to the steel, and this steel starts to rust and expand and pops concrete off. Once we start getting that separation of steel and concrete, then the structure is significantly compromised, and the weight of our brickwork and our roofs on top can cause that lintel to fail over openings as well. Another interesting thing you might discover if you're working with houses built in the typically in the 1950s, some into the 1960s, is a thing that's called brick on edge. So we know our standard brickwork, or standard size of our brick is 110 70 76. So 76 tall, 110 wide by 230 long. To save on bricks with some of these older buildings, they did brick on flat on the outside, so they were 76 tall plus 10mm mortar gap. But then on the inside, they did brick on edge, so they're 110 tall plus 10mm mortar gap. So what do you save? 20% of bricks. Well, but then by half, so 10% on your brickwork by having brick on the edge for your internal leaf walls. Typically, it's not something you have to be all too aware about. What it does, it just makes the wall a bit skinnier. But you may encounter that a bit if you're working with old buildings. So those, to create those openings above, those openings in our brickwork, we'll typically use galvanised angle lintels. Those galvanised angle lintels have to have a bearing within the brickwork. That is, so let's turn our Bankersay bungalow into a normal bungalow. We don't have our concrete lintel above that anymore. We've got our steel lintel there. That is hidden in the brickwork, by the way. In our brickwork, this is our bricks here. That's our lintel going back there like that. So all that we'll see is the bottom side of it above our window, and then we'll see that little front edge of it as well. The majority of the lintel is up inside the cavity. So our lintel goes across there like that, and this is the section hidden in the cavity. That has to have a bearing on our brickwork, and that will be defined by the manufacturer of that lintel. We have so typically 100 millimetres.
So what were you saying about the flat bar that you said is not ideal? Is that obviously just flat, it's not an angle?
That's not an angle, that's just flat. And that's just for smaller openings. So smaller openings where we don't have a lot of load above it. So let's say we've got maybe 2 or 3 courses of brickwork above it. It's just a 600 wide window, or possibly 900. It all depends on the manufacturer of those who specify those lintels. But it's where you don't have a great deal of load happening on top. So I don't know why that's written in there actually. Single leaf wall, flat bar lintel. You can use a flat bar lintel in cavity brickwork as well, or double brickwork, but it's all about the weight which is applied to the top. But because these angles are not very expensive, we try to think of our prices. For flat bar, you might pay $6 or $7 a linear metre. For angle, we probably pay sort of 8 to 12, depending on the size. You're not talking about much in the way of cost. So typically, just angle lintels go in there. There's very limited cost saving in that regard. Garage openings, typical T-bar or other welded steel beam is used because we're dealing with significantly larger spans. So it's about load and then it's about span as well. Also, replacing those lintels in some situations are LVLs as well. So our manufactured timber typically are very thick LVLs, so 63 millimetres thick LVL. So here's an example of various different lintels used above openings. So this is the T-bar lintel, which is used where we've got exposed brickwork on both sides, and we're carrying that brickwork, or it might be a cavity brick wall scenario. This detail on the bottom left-hand corner is a very rare sort of detail. You're typically not going to see that sort of detail within South Australia. Because of our reactive soils, we don't typically use such heavy construction within South Australia. This is where we've got a pre-formed concrete floor, that one's called delta core, whereas so these are our precast concrete floor slabs, and that's for a suspended second story floor. So I think the manufacturers of those are based in Western Australia. I think you typically get that sort of construction more over there where you don't have as reactive soils as we do in the Adelaide Plain. There's a series of different lintels, so lots of galvanised equal angles there, top left-hand side, and top right-hand side some lighter gauge steel lintels, and then bottom, some heavy gauge steel lintels, probably typical of a garage opening. So here's some product. Actually, no, I think this is from Australian Standard 3700. Once again, so some specification of lintel sizes for stands and construction types. So our various different scenarios there. So type A construction, we've got a fairly steep pitched tiled roof. Therefore, in construction type A, our 90 by 90 by 6mm thick equal angle will span 3.01 metres. Construction type B, where we've got cavity brick, will only span 2.05 metres. And then construction type D, single leaf masonry wall with tile roof going on the top, down to 1570. This is what you see over here in the left-hand side table. We've got 90 by 90 by 6 EA. That stands for, my eraser, make a bit of space. And I'll draw it much larger than it is in real life. 90 by 90 EA. So it's 90mm deep, 90mm wide, and 6mm thick. And the EA stands for equal angle. If we were to make it a 50 by 90, it becomes a UA, an unequal angle. So you'll see that terminology used to describe your steel work, particularly in commercial construction. You've got equal angles and unequal angles in steel work. Oh, here we have it. Yeah, so we've got all our, all of our equal angles here, 90s, 100s, and then we've got a 150, 90. So that's a UA, unequal angle. And that's it for masonry. So we're going to be heading off on the site visit soon. So not all will be coming. We can cover a little bit more of. Let's have a look. Our waterproofing, the video for the waterproofing takes a little bit longer. Although what I will use the next 25 minutes for is we can touch on plasterboard. So our internal linings for buildings, because that's a relatively small subject. So plaster's been around and used in buildings for a very long time. So it's a very simple element made from, typically made from gypsum, which is a form of calcium. Oh, actually, I'm not going to go into that. Well, I'm not going to. Can't remember the combination of the chemical makeup about plaster, but it's typically made from gypsum or lime. We don't do a great deal of traditional plastering anymore. It happened in a building that I was working in. We had an addition done to it. It had cavity masonry walls built to that addition because the owner wanted to match the original construction fairly well. But beyond that, it's not something you see very often. So our traditional plaster work, that's where we have the solid substrate. So let's say we've got our cavity masonry wall. We do a render coat on that masonry wall, then which is left rough on the outside because we want that to bond with our next coat, which is our floating coat of plaster on there, and then we do a very thin sealing coat of plaster to get a very smooth finish. So it produces a total thickness of 19mm. That's something we don't see a great deal of now within construction because it's very expensive, and the people required to do that, those skills are diminishing, within the industry, within the workforce. So we won't spend too much time on that. So yeah, lime plaster, 1 part lime putty, 2 parts sand. These mixes, which contain lime and cement, shrink on drying out, hence each coat must be allowed to shrink before further coats can be applied. Makes the process slow. So lime is used now only as a workability agent and as an accelerator for some gypsum plasters. So gypsum is a material that we've got plenty of it in South Australia, used in the production of plaster, but also used for agriculture as well to break up clay soils. We won't go through that significantly, so we'll flick down to our plasterboard. This is by and large the most relevant aspect to you as building designers, is to understand plasterboard, various different plasterboard products. Or plasterboard is a brand name. There's also Gyprock is a brand name. So it's about, and if you're using American, we're referring to American sites or videos, so they call it drywall as well. So that's typically our 10mm thick plaster, which is covered by a paper coating either side to accept paintwork. The reason we use plasterboard, or the reason we use plaster for an internal lining of a building, is because it provides a humidity flywheel for the building. It soaks up moisture and gives moisture back out to the ambient or the air within the building. So where we have high humidity in a building, it will take some of that humidity, some of that moisture out of the air. When we have low humidity, it will give moisture back to the air. So several ways to fix plasterboard depending on the substrate or frame. The same applies to plasterboard ceilings. So we've got our link there. Also, I'll just quickly shrink this down to see whether within here we also have a link to the red book. No, don't. I'll see about adding. Oh, actually, no, I can't. That's right. I can no longer add the red book in a PDF form. Or actually, I have it on a USB. Maybe I can add it as a PDF to our slides. I'll try to do that later on. But the red book, so that's put out by CSR. It contains within it all the fixing details and the specification details for various different types of plasterboard, and includes tables for all the different types of plasterboard as well. I'll have a quick look at my USB here to see if I've got it on this one. Yeah. So this is the Red Book, and it's a fairly long document. But I'll just quickly show you what's in here. I'll increase that size. So the most important bit of information is what are we 6 or 7 pages in, is our list of various different plasterboard types. So this is CSR, but Boral have something basically the same. And the other plasterboard suppliers like Nauf also do the same thing, where they have different types of plasterboard for different applications. So our here it's called Plus. That's just a fairly standard plasterboard, a 10mm plasterboard. So maybe optimized core technology that lives in it. Yeah, I won't read it out. It's just mostly marketing. Below that we've got Super Seal, which is also a plasterboard, but that's used for ceilings. The reason we have a different plasterboard for walls and a different plasterboard for ceilings is because ceilings need to resist sag. So we have 600mm fixings for our plasterboard. Our plasterboard on the ceiling needs to span between those 600mm fixings without any visible appearance of sagging. Whereas with our wall, we don't get that sagging, so we don't need to resist that. Any ideas what AquaCheck might be for? Yeah, for wet areas. So we need a different type of plasterboard for in wet areas. If we use our standard plasterboard in wet areas, it takes up too much moisture, expands, starts cracking and breaking apart. So there's moisture-resistant plasterboard for use in wet areas. Any idea what sound check is for? Scoot across again, sorry.
Soundproofing between rooms.
Yeah, so typically used between individual units within a development, because we can, typically within residential construction we can accept a degree of noise within our own house, but what we don't want to hear is the neighbours all the time. So yeah, it's for sound mitigation. There's also sensitive plasterboard made for allergy sufferers. Supercheck impact and sound resistant. The reason we have an impact resistant plasterboard, well it's for areas of high impact. That's typically going to be in developments for disabled, so for hallways and things like that, where we're going to have wheelchairs and walking frames, etc. Banging up against walls, we need an impact resistant plasterboard. And there's the Supercheck, which is both sound reduction, sound mitigation, and impact resistant. And then our very standard, standard 13mm plasterboard. So we had our standard plasterboard up here, our Plus, which is 10mm plasterboard, and then a 13mm, standard 13mm plasterboard as well, getting into the commercial range. Following on in the commercial range, also, so water resistant plasterboard, sound resistant plasterboard, specifically impact resistant plasterboard. We then have FireCheck, which is a fire resistant plasterboard. That is also a very widely used plasterboard. It's used for creating fire separation walls between units or between dwellings and garages. And I'll show you further down in the Red Book the use of that. And then you have FireCheck MR, which is moisture resistant FireCheck. So that enables bathrooms and wet areas to be built next to fire separation walls. And we have our fire separation walls between our single occupancy units. So let's say it's a unit development or multi-residential development. We have to have fire separation walls between every single unit. I guess it takes a fair bit to understand and design multi-residential timber frame construction and fire-resistant timber frame construction, a little bit more than what we've got scope to cover in here. But some basics of it are that our fire-resistant walls, our walls have to have a fire resistance level. So it has to be, has to maintain its integrity. So that means no fire can pass through. So there are no holes in the wall. Has to maintain its structure and has to maintain its insulation for a given period of time. Typically that's going to be 180, 180, 180. So 3 hours between our separate units. Fire can't pass through the wall can't fall down, and we can't get an excessive amount of heat transmitted through that wall for 3 hours. So they're designed to enable a fire happening on this side, that, raging away, and this side is going to be protected from that fire for 3 hours or 180 minutes. That fire resisting wall has to carry all the way up to our roof. So let's say our roof is happening up there, got one unit on this side, one unit on that side. The wall has to carry all the way up to our roof, and it's only our battens which are allowed to pass through there, and it has to be sealed around the battens. The rafters, etc., have to have various different designed fixing points to enable those rafters or our floors. Our floors have to be fixed in a fashion that if that floor is to burn out, it breaks away from the wall. It doesn't take, those floor joists don't go into the wall. If our floor joists went into the wall and they burn through and then they start falling down, they'll break this wall away in the process. So that is it in a very simple fashion. There's a lot more to the design of fireproof walls, but to enable those fireproof walls, or to withstand that fire, even if they're made of timber or light gauge steel, you use various different layers of that fire check plasterboard. That's what its application is. So we have typically 2 layers of fire resistant plasterboard with staggered joints, a joint here, joint there, so the joints don't line up, and then insulation in between, and then several layers of fire resistant plasterboard on the other side of that wall to create that fire separation wall. That is the other important component of this book, the red book, as well. So if I was going to see how I can click. So further down, just very quickly. So within our, just trying to find a good example of a timber frame construction firewall. This one is, well, this one's still studs. So within.
The person that owns the forward territory that's parked on the south side of the campus, number plate is X0N.
That forward territory belong to anyone in here?
7.
No, cool. Alright, we'll push on. Yeah. So with our fire resisting walls, just as a quick example, so there are various different requirements for these fire separation walls for various different scenarios. This one doesn't have particularly stringent requirements, so that's for half an hour. That one has to resist. So 30 minutes of integrity, 30 minutes of structure, 30 minutes of insulation. And that can be done, so we've got our 30mm gyprock, fire check, and then gyprock plus. So CSR have provided all of these details to be able to design walls to resist fire using their products. And it's a huge investment on their part to do all the design and then all the testing to ensure that they can meet those fire requirements. But the reason they do that is because they want you to buy their products, basically. So they have supplied all of the technical details.
Can the owner of a Ford Territory registration number X0M677 please attend to your vehicle? You are blocking traffic. Thank you.
So they've done all those details for you. So when it comes to the specification of fire resisting walls and to understand how much width in a floor plan you have to accommodate for them, you can refer to literature like the Red Book for getting the complete details for those. So this is just.
Would you advise that you purchase something like this when you start working?
Oh, most definitely, but you can get it for free as well.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so I'll hopefully later today I'll get a chance to include it onto Moodle as a PDF. That might work for you guys to just grab it off there. That might be simple enough. But it's also free for you to get it as well from CSR. They want to make it as easy as possible for you to essentially access these details so you specify their products. But yeah, you can do the same thing for Boral as well. Just go online, search for CSR Red Book, and then you have to make your own login. So you have to put give your email, your name, your occupation, that sort of thing, to get a free copy of it. Yeah. But most definitely, so if you're going to be designing and specifying buildings, particularly in a multi-residential scenario, by all means, yeah, you'd have to have access to product literature of this sort. To do this sort of design and whole wall testing analysis is way too expensive for any individual or even an architect to take on. So that's why our manufacturers have done that. So, but you are locked into using their products doing that. So that's the Red Book, and that's going to be, well, that or the Boral equivalent is going to be a very important resource for you for understanding plasterboard. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for today because we've got to get to our site visit at midday. Are there any questions, particularly in relation to any of the assignments or any clarification required or any assistance required?
Can you just shift the date for tomorrow's assignment?
Can I what?
Tomorrow, we are submitting one tomorrow. Can you shift the date? Just extend it a little bit.
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can do that individually. We don't have a great deal of time to play with, and also because it's very busy right at the end of the semester, I do need to get into marking as soon as possible. So I'm not very keen to move it. But are there other people who are having issue in meeting that deadline?
Yes, I actually emailed you yesterday asking if I could get an extension until Monday.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Because I don't find any forms on here when you fill in it. Is there a form that we're meant to fill in to ask for an extension?
There is, yeah. I think it's in the before you start tile on Moodle, but that's okay. Yeah. Apologise. I've been away working without internet access the last few days, so I just got back last night. So yeah, for all the emails that were sent through, I haven't just I looked at a few last night. That's about it. So yeah, I don't mind providing short extensions on this, and I'll work that out individually. But yeah, we are getting to the end where things are piling up, and probably because you have various different other subjects as well. I understand that you're very busy, so I'll work with you on that. But so for yourself, next Monday.
The Monday coming up.
Monday coming up, yeah. I don't have an issue with that because I'm not likely to get any marking done over the weekend. I'm working through the weekend, so
Thank you.
yeah, that's fine. And or you can send me an email, and then we'll work through with you on that, or I'll have a chat with you individually.
Alright, thank you.
Okay, so beyond that, any questions or queries? No? Okay, well thank you very much. So for those catching a lift with me over to the site, follow me to my car, I'll pack things up. For those of you who have been able to achieve your site visits independently, that's fantastic, bit of an early minute. And for those making your way there under your own steam, you've got the directions to get there. Oh, cheers, thank you very much for that. Yes. Everything now we take is pass or fail. But what's embedded, you don't have to stress too much about that typically. What's embedded in the assignments are several opportunities to meet the criteria. So there's basically a checklist of criteria that students have to meet. And if you want to check out that criteria, it's included in this section here before you start. We've got the unit descriptor.
Yep.
But typically if you've been to lectures, you actually pay attention and do a little bit of work yourself, you should be fine. Yeah, there should be no issue with that. And also, could I get a little bit of help from you? And the presentation I did ages ago with the concrete things that's from my own training that I have to do, I also have to fill out this learner record sheet as well, so that so my assessor got back to me while I was away to say, oh look, you've got to tick that box as well, so if you could fill that out, that would be fantastic. That session I did with the concrete estimates with the peers, I have to do another form for my system as well. Yes. Yep, that's fine. I've got extra vests, extra hard hats, and some extra steel hat boots as well. So I brought some extras. Do you ever make your way over there yourself, or do you need to? That's your right. Yes. Do you need to come in my car, or can you go over there with your own car? You'll drive. Great. Okay. And yeah, we'll be able to bring that along with you.
Do you remember the date that we did that?
It was on the 12th or the 4th. What's that? Oh, you don't need to. You do need to. You don't want to come? You don't need to come. Yeah, that's fine. That's great. So good work. Thanks for that. What's that? Oh yeah. Yep, sure. Method of forming hip ends. So that relates to where we've got trusses, and possibly that info from Thomas has got hip ends. Yes, I've got some hip ends on that building. So throughout the main part of the roof, we have standard trusses. And these are all denoted as S1s. So they're all S1 standard trusses. S2s are slightly different because we've got a cantilever happening here. So that's all fine. When we get to this hip end, we get a bunch of other things happening. We have our H4s, which are our hip trusses, and then our TG1, that's our truncated girder truss. That's a very thick, heavy truss that runs through at what's called our second station. That holds up our hip trusses. So our hip trusses mount onto that girder truss. And then our jack trusses, which are small triangular trusses, these ones here. In fact, that's the detail there.
Yeah, that's the hip truss.
Oh, that's hip truss, right. Oh yeah, thanks. Well, our jack trusses in elevation look basically the same as our actually. Oh, it's odd. Our hip truss should have a top chord which extends much further than that. Anyhow, yeah, okay.
Every single one.
So you got every single one. So yeah. Oh yeah, okay. So that's H1s. H1s are. So you'll be able to match it H. So that's an H1 here. So we've got a small triangular section there, and we're mounting off our MG1. That's our main girder 1 or something M. So girder 1. So it's mounting our MG1 there, and that top chord cells. What's that? Mono valley. Yeah. But our hip ends. So we've got very simple hip ends happening around the place. Yeah. Yeah. But our easiest hip end to understand is this hip end that's happening in there. We've got hip trusses, we've got our jack trusses, and then we've got these tiny little triangular trusses called creeper trusses that join up to our hip, and they mount onto our hip trusses. So our truncated girder truss, our TG1, that is carrying all of these things here. So when it gets to method of forming hip ends, you describe that as the hip end is formed by the use of several trusses that are different to our standard trusses. Those trusses are called our truncated girder truss, which is taking the majority of the load of the hip. Our hip trusses, which form the hip ends in our hip, and then our jack and creeper trusses, which fill in the space between our hip trusses and our girder truss.
Describing how to build like this sort of section.
Exactly. So So method of forming hip ends. How do we build this hip end?
I was thinking
What do we
like
use?
the hip truss, like how to form like.
Yeah, no, it's about forming the hip end of that roof. So talk about the various different types of trusses that go into making that hip end.
And then gutter fixing.
Yeah, so method of gutter fixing, that's typically going to be with gutter brackets. That might not be specified on these plans. It might be specified on these plans. It's not specified on the plans? Yeah. Just say, you can say either on site there was no obvious method of gutter fixing, or, so that's our section there. Yeah, gutters as per schedule. So unless you actually have, typically don't write gutter fixing in the schedule either. So you'll say gutter fixing was not specified on the plans and was not evident on site. It would be as per manufacturer's details. So the details, the manufacturer of the
And then what I
the
got
gutters.
and just say like the typical installation.
Yes, you can. Yes, definitely. You can say typical installation is going to be with gutter brackets at 1 metre centres. So we've got it.